All right, so Chapter 11 deals with landlord and tenant issues. Pretty much everything we have discussed up to this point has been about owning property, selling property, changing ownership. Even the agency discussions we've had have all centered around sales. But there is a huge part of our business that leaves untouched. Leasing is also a major part of having a real estate license. That is especially true. How many of you have an interest in working in commercial real estate rather than residential? Do I have any folks who have interest in commercial real estate? I see Cassie's hand, and Sierra's got her hand up, and Danya and Jeb. Yeah. So we got some folks that want to work in commercial real estate. Those of you who have an interest in working in commercial real estate will be much more likely to encounter leases than you will to encounter sales transactions. It's just much more common on the commercial side for things to be leases. That doesn't mean we don't have leases on the residential side. We know we absolutely do. It just means as a real estate broker, if you work on the residential side, you're more likely to be involved with sales. If you work on the commercial side, you're more likely to be involved with leases. But there are much different rules about commercial leasing than there are residential leases. And so we have to focus on the impact of those different rules, those different laws, those different regulations. Even though leases are probably ultimately more prevalent in the commercial side, there's a lot more rules about leases on the residential side. So we've got to go through those and got to understand the differences, because this relationship is an important relationship, this landlord-tenant relationship and what's involved. And you're going to have to broaden your horizons, because for many of you, you've only thought of leases in one format. You've sort of, the lease most people have experience with, if they have experience with leases, are residential leases. And so they tend to think about how their residential lease work and apply that to all leases, but that's simply not true. The way your residential lease works is going to be very different from the way a lot of, if not most, commercial leases work. And so we have to learn the differences between all of those. Way back in Chapter 2, we learned the word freehold. Anybody remember what freehold means? What the one-word definition of freehold was?
Ownership.
I heard a lot of you say ownership, and that is exactly right. Ownership is absolutely what freehold means. So when we say non-freehold, we mean estates, relationships, interests that are not ownership based. Well, what's the opposite of ownership when you're talking about real estate? Leasing.
Rental.
Rental, exactly. So non-freehold simply means leases. That's all it means. It's just a non-freehold estate. That word estate, that's in a vocabulary word that will pop up on the test. What is an estate? Remember, that's just a legal relationship that somebody has to a property. Tasha owns her home, so she has a freehold estate in the property. Seth rents where he lives, so he has a non-freehold estate in the property. Does that make sense for everybody? It's just a different way to label what the relationship is. And leases are non-freehold. There are 4 main categories, just like we had different categories of ownership. Remember, we had fee simple absolute, and we had life estates, and we had fee simple subject to a condition, and fee simple determinable. Some of you just threw up a little bit in your mouth as I was naming all those off, because you remember you're going to have to know those still. We haven't left those behind. There are 4 categories of leases. Now, these are not nearly as in-depth and complex as the ownership estates are, but there are 4 different categories of leases. And I will tell you that most of you, if you have familiarity with leases, for most of you, This is the one that you have familiarity with. This is the one that is most common because this one is the one that you are going to see in residential. Residential leases are periodic tenancies. Commercial leases mostly are here. And then this stuff down here at the bottom, this is the weird stuff. This is just weird. You know, we always got to throw some weird stuff in there. But for even though there's 4, what did I just tell you? For all practical purposes, how many different types of leases are there? 2. There's the periodic tenancy, and there's the tenancy for years, and if you see estate for years, that means the same thing. An estate for years is the same thing as a tenancy for years. A periodic tenancy is the same thing as a periodic estate. You can substitute that word estate in there anytime. So let's talk about the differences between these. Now, I'm going to back up again. Tenancy for years. What did I say that was most likely to be? What kind of property? Commercial, right? Commercial. So, if it's most likely to be commercial, let's start with the simplest one. And we're starting with the commercial side, even though it may not be as familiar because it's much more simple. The estate or period or tenancy for years. Most confusing word in the whole thing is this one right here. Ignore that word. It's going to be hard on a test because that's where they're going to try to trip you up. Because guess what? An estate for years is the same thing as an estate for weeks or months or days. What it really is an estate for a definite period of time, a defined period of time. We know when it begins. We know for sure when it ends. And we'll say that again. We know when it begins, and we know for sure when it ends. This is going to be the hardest part about differentiating these that you're going to struggle with, and it's going to be your own hard-headedness that's going to get in your way. Those of you that have a residential lease, do you know for sure when it ends? What do you think the answer to that question is?
Yes.
No.
Yes.
You do not.
Because it's you run it for a year, but then you can go to month to month.
That's exactly right. Every residential lease you will ever see in the state of North Carolina, you have no idea when it's going to end because it doesn't end until one of the two parties says it ends. What you know is that the lease is for at least a year. But then when it ends past that, who the heck knows? Because here's what it'll say. It'll say, and then it renews automatically to month, unless the landlord gives you what? That they want you out.
Notice.
Or unless you give the landlord what? That you want to get out.
Notice.
And if you don't give notice, guess when it's going to end?
Never.
So you play this game with me. If neither party ever gives notice to the other party, how long does a residential lease last?
Forever.
Definite.
Forever. That is not an estate for years. That is not a definite time period. Commercial leases almost always are estates for years, ones that have a definite end date. They don't say anything about giving you notice because no notice is required. Your lease ends on June 30th. Boom. Nobody's going to remind you your lease ends on June 30th. You're expected to know it and get the heck out. Does that make sense for everybody? An estate for years is for a definite period of time. If you see a short description of a lease, it's almost always an estate for years on a test because it's short and sweet. Joy rents a home at the beach for 2 weeks. Is that a periodic tenancy or is that an estate for years? Well, it's an estate for years because we know exactly how long Joy has rented that property, and it is 2 weeks. So the keys to recognizing an estate for years is the period of time is absolutely defined with no statement made about renewing it, no statement made about how it's going to automatically renew itself, no notice required from the landlord, no notice required from the tenant. I can't define it any differently than that. You have to accept the definition. If there is no statement made about renewal or notice, it's an estate for years. That means it ends when it ends, period. Now, can they choose to renew it if they want to? Can they choose to write a new lease and come up with a new lease? Of course they can, but it's not going to happen automatically. Somebody has to take in fact, you want to think of it this way. If I'm in a residential lease and I want to get out, do I need to do something?
Yes, you'd have to give a 30-day notice.
I got to give notice. If I'm in a commercial lease and I want to get out, do I need to give notice?
No.
No notice required.
No notice required. If I'm a residential landlord and I want the tenant to leave when their lease ends, do I need to do something?
Yes, you have to give them a 30-day notice.
I have to give them notice. If I'm a commercial landlord and I want the lease to end, I want the tenant to leave when their lease ends, do I need to do anything? No. That's the difference between the two. Does everybody see that? Okay. So best way to think of estate for years, no notice required. This already says it there, but no notice required. That's the key to an estate for years. Versus the periodic tenancy. Now,
Travis, real quick, Brittany had a question on the end lease date. So does it mean anything, or that it's just going to automatically renew?
So, it does mean something, Brittany. The end lease date on a residential lease means they're guaranteed that it will be at least that long. Don't think of it as, so a 1-year residential lease is not really a 1-year residential lease. It's a lease of at least 1 year.
At least 1 year.
But it could be longer if they let it go. Whereas a 1-year commercial lease, a 1-year estate for years is exactly 1 year.
Right. Because I got a little confused whenever you said that it was something about the date or whatever. But the reason why I was asking is because whenever we go over a lease and we explain it to them, we say this is when your lease technically ends, but we're going to send you, and that's my job, is to send them an email 30 days prior, although I tend to do it 60 days and then 30 days.
And the reason you do that is because you're required to by law, because the structure of their lease says that if you don't give them notice, their lease goes on, even though it's past the date that's written on the document. And so what really matters more than the date on the document in a periodic tenancy is the notice. What matters in an estate for years is the date that's on the document, because nobody's going to give notice.
Right. Okay. That's where I got confused. Thank you.
That's the difference between the two. Okay.
Travis, I have a question about the tenancy for years. Can it be renewed if notice is given? Can they renew it?
They can. They can certainly engage in discussions and negotiations to renew the lease, but it's one of those things where it's looked at from the exact opposite perspective. If you reach out to your landlord in a commercial setting, you're reaching out because you want to talk to them about renewal. If you reach out to your landlord in a residential setting in the periodic tenancy, you're reaching out because you want to end it. So it's the exact opposite approach. Okay. And the reason we do this with the periodic tenancy, if you think about it, a lot of times residential tenants are not, how many residential tenants do you think have no idea when their lease expires? How many of them would be caught completely off guard and homeless if you just changed locks the day after their lease expired? If you never called them, you never gave them notice, you just went over there and changed the lock, would that be a miss?
Yes.
Yeah.
And so that's why the law says you can't handle a residential tenancy that way. The law says residential tenancies have to be these ones that automatically renew themselves. Landlords hate these leases. A landlord would always rather have a definitive lease. They would rather have the estate for years because they know exactly when it ends. They know exactly when it begins. They know exactly when it ends. And if they wanted to renew it, they'll renew it. But on residential tenancies, they don't get that choice. The state has decided for you that residential tenancies will be a periodic tenancy, which requires notice. Okay. Now, as to how much notice is required, just like I said to you yesterday, always look at the sales contract. When you want to know what the answer to a question about the sales transaction is, look at the contract. What do you think I'm going to tell you about when you ask me how much notice is required? Look at the what?
Contract, the lease.
Look at the contract. Look at the lease. The lease is going to specify exactly how much notice is required, hopefully. If it doesn't, the state has some minimum notice requirements, but you might be surprised at how short those minimum notice requirements can be. So it's much better to put in the written lease what the notice requirements are. The notice requirements are always going to be determined by the lease. The only way the state determines how much notice is required is if the lease doesn't say. Is that okay with everybody?
Yes.
Now, I heard Brittany a couple times mention she has to give 30 days notice. Well, that depends on the type of lease she has as far as whether she has to give 30 days notice or not. But it also depends on what their written lease says. If their written lease says 30 days notice, then that's the notice she has to give. What if their written lease says 60 days notice? And how much notice does she have to give?
60 days.
60.
And by the way, that notice works exactly the same for both parties. So if it says the landlord has to give 60 days notice, then what does that mean for the tenant? They also have to give 60 days notice. Okay. So it's going to be the same for both sides. As far as the notice to terminate goes, these right here in this section, these are the minimum notices required by the state of North Carolina. Minimum. Most written leases will specify even bigger time frames. If you notice here, if somebody's renting month to month, how much notice does the state of North Carolina say you have to give as the minimum?
1 week.
1 week.
7 days.
7 days. And that's why most written leases are more specific and specify more time. The minimum notice for somebody who has a 1 year or more lease is going to be 1 month, but that's minimum. Their lease could specify 60 days or 90 days. It's whatever is written in the lease. You only apply the minimums if the lease doesn't say. Now, if the lease says 30 days, then it's always 30 days. I don't care even if they've converted to month, they still have a written lease. And that's the other thing. I want you to understand this. When we say the lease renews, we mean the lease renews. Everything about the lease renews. So if somebody has a written lease that says their rent is $1,500 a month, and that's all it says about the rent, and it's a residential lease, a periodic tenancy, and it says it's a $1,500 a month lease with 30 days minimum notice from either the landlord or the tenant, and nobody calls anybody when that lease is coming toward its end, what's that lease going to do?
Renew itself.
It's going to renew. Now, here's the thing. Here's what I want you to understand. If that was a 1 year lease, and all it says is Travis has leased this property for 1 year beginning on June 1st of 2019 and extending through May 31st of 2020. That's what the lease says. And nobody gives anybody notice. What is the lease going to do?
Remain the same.
Month to month.
It's going to renew itself, not as month to month. It's going to renew
for a
itself
year.
exactly as it's written.
Put it in
If
the
it was a 1-year lease, guess what it renews as?
A 1-year lease.
A 1-year lease. And guess what the rent is for that next year?
The same amount.
The same amount. Because every single period, punctuation mark, and dot that was in that original lease gets renewed into the new lease. Does that make sense for everybody? That's what we mean when we say it automatically renews. So if you're the landlord and you're aware of that, would it be smart to write things into that lease that say, when it automatically renews, it's only going to renew as month to month, and the
That's
new
what I was
rent
gonna
is
ask.
going to be this amount? Could we write that into the lease?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, but folks, if you don't, it's going to renew exactly as it was. Do not get caught up in that situation. Here's where this is super dangerous. Super dangerous. Oral leases are enforceable in North Carolina. So let's say that Joy owns a property and she rents it to her friend for a year, and they just do a handshake agreement. We're going to rent it for a year at $1,500 a month. They never put it in writing, and nobody gives notice to anybody. A year later, Joy says to the friend, well, you supposed to be out last week. And the friend says, why? And Joy said, well, I only leased it to you for a year. And the friend said, well, you didn't give me notice that I needed to leave, so I assumed I could stay. Who's correct, Joy or the friend?
The friend.
Friend.
And not only can the friend stay for that month, they can stay for that year, folks. Because that lease is going to renew exactly under the original terms until somebody gives notice. Is everybody following me on that? And that's why it is so important to write into the original terms how it will renew. Can we say in the original terms, and if it automatically renews, it's only going to renew as month to month? Could we write that into the original lease? That's super important. And if you want that rental amount to be different when it goes month to month, you better say it in there, because you can't just change it just because you want to. That's why this automatic renewal thing is such a big deal. It's a huge deal if you don't understand it, because the law always favors tenants in residential settings.
Mm-hmm.
It's the landlord who's expected to know what they're doing, not the tenant. Okay? So
Travis, is the only difference between tenancy for years and periodic tenancy the notice of termination?
Is the only difference between tenancy for years and periodic tenancy notice? Pretty much. Absolutely. There's no notice required in an estate for years, and notice is required in a periodic tenancy. Brittany said, how does it not become a case of he said, she said when it comes to an oral lease? It does. But I can tell you, in a case of he said, she said, a magistrate in a court in North Carolina will always favor the tenant. Always. And that's why, as a landlord, an oral lease is a bad idea. It's a bad idea.
So even in, like, for example, even in a case whenever you have a written lease, and you have, like, I will send out notifications saying, hey, your lease expires in 30 days, or your lease expires in 60 days, I'll send another reminder close to day 30. At that time, if they choose to say, well, you didn't send us a lease, and we have proof that we did, then we're good. We're covered.
That's correct. You've provided written notice of, now, and here's what the notice needs to be of them to vacate the property. Not written notice that your lease is expiring, because that's not specific enough. It needs to say written notice that by this date, you either have to come to new lease terms or you have to vacate the property. That's what the written notice should say.
Because, like, normally what I'll do is I'll send them, if the owner has approved for them to stay for another year, then what I'll do is I'll go ahead and draft up another lease agreement and say, this is your renewal, the price is staying the same or the price has gone up. If you go to a month to month, it increases so much of amount. And then I'll send that to them at day 60, and then if I haven't heard anything, I'll send it to them again at day 30.
Which keeps you in compliance with the law.
Okay.
Which means if you still haven't heard from them by the time their lease expires, the expectation is that they will be out of the property because you have properly given them notice that they either had to renew a lease or their lease was coming to an end and they need to vacate.
Because that's the part I was a little confused of. If I've done all that, then how does that work as far as on their end? If they still have not complied and answered to email, phone call, text, whatever, then automatically by that end of the lease date, they need to be
Their
out.
lease is terminated. Their lease is terminated because you've properly given them notice that their lease was expiring, and they now know they have to either come to some terms for a new lease or vacate the property by that date. And if they don't vacate the property, then you would have to go through the legal process of removing them from the property, but you would have the legal right to remove them from the property.
So it'd be like the eviction process. Would start the eviction process.
Summary judgment, the eviction process.
Okay.
That's right.
So I have a question. If they don't sign and you haven't evicted, would you raise their rent after a year to the amount you said?
Ask that again, Sheila. Let me make sure I understand.
And like say if the new lease that Brittany sent out had the increase in rent
Okay.
and they didn't sign a lease and you haven't yet evicted them, would you raise the rent on year 2?
Well, you've actually asked a bunch of questions bundled into one there.
I see,
It
yeah.
may seem like a simple question, but it's not. If you've given them notice that they either need to vacate or agree to a new lease,
Right,
then they need to do one of those two things. They either need to agree to a new lease or they need to vacate. If they have not done either one of those things by that date, then the choice for you now becomes, do you evict them or not? Because at that point, they are still existing in the property outside of their lease. Now, you choose very carefully, because if you choose to accept rent from them, to continue to accept rent from them at the old amount, most courts will say you just agreed to extend the lease. So you have to choose very carefully. My suggestion would be you begin eviction proceedings against them. You follow through with what you said you were going to do.
got it. Just to cover yourself.
Right. Because if here's what happens. If you give them notice and say, okay, your rent's going up to $1,600 a month, or you have to vacate the property, and they never sign a new lease, they don't vacate the property, and they send you $1,500 a month, which was the old lease amount, you send it back. You say, no, these are not the terms. The terms were you either vacate the property, we gave you notice, or you agree to new lease terms at $1,600 a month. Because if you take the $1,500, a magistrate would probably say, well, as far as I'm concerned, you renegotiated. You caved. You changed your terms. And now they have a new lease at $1,500 a month. So don't do that.
Yeah.
Put yourself in that situation.
Thank
I have
you.
a question.
Yeah.
What if something changes with your financials in between your renew dates? That happens. Do you have to kind of like reapply?
What do you mean?
Like, let's say your lease ends and you don't have a job. Like you just lost your job and your apartment is about to be renewed, but you're still gonna stay there. Do they have to have proof of income to renew?
That's between the landlord and the tenant. I mean, it's always up to the landlord to decide who they want to lease to, and they can use income as one of those processes. Most landlords generally don't choose to verify income on a renewing tenant, because especially if the tenant's in good standing, they assume they'll remain in good standing. But they could if they wanted to. That's up to the landlord what they want to use as their tenant screening process, to decide whether or not they want to renew the lease.
And I just have one other question. So I used to live in an apartment, and my neighbors, they actually, when they moved, they said that like the leasing office and everything told them that they couldn't renew their lease.
Sure. There's no obligation for a landlord to renew a lease. They can simply give notice, we're not renewing your lease.
Okay.
You're not obligated to renew anyone's lease.
Right.
And when I did residential property management, quite honestly, that was usually the best course of action when we had a troubled tenant, if we had a tenant that was hard collecting rent from, that sort of thing, and they had 4 or 5 months left on their lease, in some cases it was better to just ride out the 4 or 5 months rather than try to begin eviction proceedings on them. Just give them notice. We're not renewing your lease, period. Under no circumstances are we renewing your lease, because you're not required to.
And what about with COVID? Because right now, if you don't have money to pay your rent, then you just
That's a
don't
whole
pay.
different, yeah, that is indeed true right now, but that's not going to be tested at all. So it's, kind of beyond the scope of our conversation. But yes, there are limits on the powers to evict tenants right now because of the pandemic, and rightfully so in a lot of cases.
Right. So when it comes to renew their lease, can they hold this time accountable for your overall
Sure.
renewal?
I mean, you could choose not to renew someone's lease. That is vastly different from choosing to evict them for non-payment.
But it's because
remember, the only way to get them out, even if you don't renew their lease, is they either leave voluntarily or you evict them. So even if you don't renew their lease, they don't have to leave, and you might not be able to evict them. You still can't file for eviction right now because of the pandemic. So you'd be in the same situation with a tenant you didn't want necessarily.
Okay.
Is this North Carolina or nationwide?
So far, what we've talked about is pretty generic everywhere. We're going to talk about specifics of North Carolina residential rentals, but now the minimum notice requirements are North Carolina's minimum notice. But the differences between an estate for years and a periodic tenancy, those are the same everywhere.
All right. Thank you. Thanks.
Hey, Travis, I have a question real quick before we move on.
Sure. Go ahead, Ethan.
So I was just looking at my lease, and the lease actually says on the first page, it says the lease term does not automatically renew or revert to a month-to-month status at the end of the lease term. Unless the resident enters into a new lease of the apartment prior to the end date, resident must vacate the apartment by the date and time specified above. So would that be considered a tenancy for years, but it's residential?
That would be considered illegal under North Carolina law. That entire lease would be thrown out if it ended up in a court in North Carolina.
Oh, good, because I want out of it anyway.
The answer to your question is yes, that is an estate for years. But the bigger question is, why the hell have they done an estate for years for a residential lease in North Carolina? Because the North Carolina Residential Rental Agreements Act does not allow that.
Okay.
So, I'm not an attorney. Okay. I don't even play one on TV. So
right.
Consult with your handy dandy attorney, but that lease is that's not a residential lease in North Carolina.
Okay.
Travis, can you put limitations in the residential lease to what can be done in the home?
Sure. Residential, commercial, industrial, doesn't matter what kind of lease it is. The landlord and tenant can always negotiate the terms of the lease, and those terms could include limitations on what kinds of activities could be conducted in the home, assuming there are not other overriding federal or local laws that require that activity. You can't, for example, you cannot have a residential lease that says someone can't install a wheelchair ramp because that's protected by federal law as a handicapping status. But you could certainly have a residential lease that says someone cannot have pets. Or that they could have pets, or someone cannot smoke in the property, or they could smoke in the property. All of those are allowable restrictions to be written into residential leases.
You can sit there and say that you can't conduct certain businesses.
Sure.
And okay. Because we had a tenant that we're in the eviction process now, which because the courts are not opening up for us to do anything, it's just a long process.
Right, you're gonna have to wait for a court date until after it's over.
Yeah, but we I had went in and did a home inspection with them, and I was asking them, I was like, what do you do? And she said that she was a cam girl, and I was like, okay, but. No, this is very inappropriate. I'm so sorry.
I'm thinking I understand what that means, but
yeah, trust me, I didn't know what it was, and my boss told me. Fabian told me, the one who took your class.
Yeah.
So anyway, a part of her job was to host people, but Terry, I'm not explaining what that is. I'm sorry. That no.
It sounds like it's something in the adult entertainment industry.
It is. But we had gotten complaints from neighbors and stuff because of parties and stuff like that happening. So, and we have now put.
I would say that's definitely something that could be limited in the written terms of it. Not conducting.
So they've actually gone to their lawyer and now have put in our portion of the lease no kind of like businesses that are deemed unlawful, or I can't remember the exact terms of it.
You could even say of an adult nature in reference to
adult,
so they're
limit those.
They're putting something like that along those frames in our lease contracts now because of that situation happening.
So that's a reasonable limitation on the lease. Now I would say you might not have the ability to enforce that on this tenant because it wasn't already in their lease, but for future.
Yeah, because now she's like, because whenever I checked my work emails last night, she's emailing us with her lawyer saying, y'all can't do this because it's not part of the lease. But we found out that in North Carolina, it is against the law to do that inside of a residential
I'm not up to date on those laws. Hayden said
I didn't either, but apparently I am now.
Well, Hayden said you were running all the fun during the pandemic, so
I felt it was. I learned a lot. I felt like I was a little angel until I walked into that.
Yeah, there you go. But no, absolutely, leases can limit and should limit, what the expected activities within the premises are. Most residential leases will say, only for residential purposes. They can't conduct any sort of a home business because there've been problems with people doing hair out of properties they rent, and then I even had one in Durham one time. The lady was teaching piano lessons, and you think, oh well, what in the world could be the harm with that? Except she had like 6 cars parked all the time in front of the house, and neighbors couldn't even get in their driveways because people were always parked out there sitting there waiting to pick up their kids, because she would do like these group lessons with like 6 or 7 kids at the time, and all their parents are, it's only an hour, so they're all parked out in the street, and people are like going crazy because they couldn't get in their own driveways. So yeah, you can definitely have.
Does that rule change during like this time during the pandemic?
I'm not currently involved in residential property management, so I have steered clear of the COVID-based, implications. All I know is you can file for eviction, but you can't get a court date right now. I don't know what the other specifics are.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm sorry to go down that rabbit hole.
No, that's all right. That's all right. So Justine said she had somebody with a whole setup for that. So apparently it's a blossoming industry. There you go. We can all make some extra money. We all got the cam set up, obviously. So
it's a lot of work though. Like you have to have a huge following base.
I just don't even want to know what my target audience would be. So I don't even want to think about
the people that pay.
I don't.
That's all you care about.
Well, I know, but that would scare me who that would be. So I just
There's creepy people out there too.
No thanks. No thanks. I don't blame anybody else who wants to, but not me. Mm-mm.
Y'all notice that Seth knows what this is. He didn't ask.
You got awful quiet over there.
Hey, I'm just moderating. Let's tighten the reins.
So with these tenancies, with these periodic tenancies, as I said, the key here is the notice to terminate, that there being a minimum notice requirement with periodic tenancy. In North Carolina, the default is month to month. If you can't, if you don't have a written lease and you can't prove some agreement for longer than that, most courts would say you probably had a month to month agreement. The estate at will. Now we've left sort of the legitimate framework of leases now, and now we're going to ones that are much less common. The estate at will is one in which neither the landlord nor the tenant are bound. It's basically permission to be there. It is an agreement by the landlord to let the tenant stay for as long as they'd like or not stay. It is an agreement by the tenant, okay, I have your permission to be here, but I don't guarantee you I will be here. Does that make sense? There's no commitment on either side with an estate at will. It's just at will. It's tenant stays as long as they want to. Landlord can tell them to get out whenever they want to. That's an estate at will. So that's about the only way they could present it to you on the test, quite honestly. For obvious reasons, these are very uncommon. To have an estate at will. It's very uncommon to have someone just, have the free right to stay or go as they please in a property. I will tell you that this is what legally the courts would say you would have if you basically let someone live in your property for free. If you let someone live in your property for free, most likely the courts would say that's an estate at will, which is important for the landlord because that means they can probably tell you to get out at any time if there's no, exchange of rent. But I will say, if there's any payment of rent whatsoever, most courts will go back and say, okay, you have a month-to-month periodic tenancy if there's any payment of rent. And so usually an estate at will means you don't have any agreement formally with each other. It's just permission to stay. Okay.
So,
and Terry said, so like a home that may not be up to standard, so you let them stay for free. Exactly, Terry. If you've got a home, like for example, my late grandparents' home was built in the 1800s, and we have family members that live there, and they just don't have anywhere else to go. And my mom and her sister don't want to tear the house down, but they don't really want to do any work to it to rent it out, so they just let their cousin stay there. And I guess he does little odds and ends things around the property, but it's not even really expected. It's not like he says, you do this and you can stay here. I mean, it's just a place for him to stay. That's an estate at will.
So I have a family home, and my uncle is the one who operates it. And a while back, I had a cousin who needed to live there because she was in really bad health condition and ended up passing away. So she ended up staying there because she didn't really have to upkeep the property because somebody else was doing it. That would be considered an estate at will?
Yes, that's exactly right. There's no formal agreement by either the landlord or the tenant.
So how do you know they have an estate at will?
The biggest sign is they're not paying rent. Because if they're paying rent, most courts would say that's a periodic tenancy.
But if you don't have a contract, how is it proven that they...
Remember what I said, not all agreements have to be in writing. And so lease it, well, that's why they're not a good idea. See, you want the perfect answer. What are you trying to put Judge Judy out of business? If oral leases were not enforceable, there'd be no reason to have Judge Judy on television. If oral contracts were not enforceable, that's where you get the he said, she said entertainment of small claims court. Because of if everything had to be in writing, it would be a simple open and shut case. But leases can be oral. And so it's not a good idea to have them be oral because you're leaving it up to a court what they think happened, what they think is the case. And most courts, if they see rent being paid, would say, you probably have a periodic tenancy.
Okay.
If they see no rent being paid, they would probably say this is an estate at will.
That makes better sense.
Okay. And then the last one, there's another word I have for an estate at sufferance. That one. Estates at sufferance are essentially trespassing. The only difference between a trespasser and an estate at sufferance is the person who has an estate at sufferance had the right to be there legally at some point. But that right has come and gone. And they're still there. And they won't leave. That is someone who has an estate at sufferance. They still have a legal interest in the property because they're still occupying it. They just don't have the legal right to occupy it. So this would be like we call them holdover tenants. Brittany, have you ever had a holdover tenant? Somebody that you all have given notice they're supposed to be out and they don't leave?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So a holdover tenant is an estate at sufferance. It is someone who was supposed to have vacated the property, but has not done so. And this could be in either commercial or in residential. You know, Justine said they're annoying. Yes, they are. Now, here's the thing I want you all to understand. Even if they are a holdover tenant, even if they clearly have no legal right to still be in possession of the property, you still have to go through the formal ejection procedures to force them to leave if they won't leave voluntarily. Tenants only leave in two ways in North Carolina. They leave of their own free will, or they are ejected by a court of law. Please do not practice, and we're going to talk about the terminology here in a minute, something called self-help eviction. I call it shotgun eviction. You know, none of the showing up and kicking somebody out or changing the locks or turning off the power. Or I had one guy one time say, well, we removed all the toilets to get them to leave. No, just no, don't do that. There are only two legal ways for a tenant to leave in North Carolina. They leave of their own free will, and you go through the summary ejectment process. And it's very much preferable, the leave of their own free will part. Very much preferable. So, how are leases paid? Now, this is different from these four types of leases. We've covered the four types of leases. Now we want to talk about how the rent is paid, the structure of the rent payment. This is what we're focusing on now. Not how they are created or how they end, not whether we have to give notice or don't give notice. We finished that. Now we want to talk about how the rent payment itself is structured, because there are different structures, just like there are different structures for the leases, there are different ways of making payment on leases. The most common in the residential side is something called the gross lease. A gross lease is almost always found in residential leases. The term gross just means before expenses. So if you make a gross lease payment, that means the payment you make is before any of the expenses have been applied toward operating the property. And the landlord is expected to pay those expenses out of their own funds. So they better make sure the lease or the rent amount is enough to cover that, plus make them some money. What this means from that's the legal definition. Here's what this means from a practical standpoint. Since the tenant pays one amount, a gross amount, and only a gross amount, who is responsible then for things such as upkeep and maintenance and property taxes and insurance? Who would pay for all of that in a gross lease setting?
Landlord.
It would be the landlord. For this reason, the residential leases in North Carolina are required to be gross rent payments, because the Residential Rental Agreements Act requires landlords to perform maintenance on the property, requires landlords to maintain the property, to pay property taxes, to do those kinds of things. So residential leases in North Carolina are set up as gross leases because they have to be. Some commercial leases might be gross leases, but very few of them. Very few of them. Are we all okay so far on the idea of gross lease is the one you're most accustomed to if you've done a residential lease before. If you pay your gross lease payment and the HVAC system breaks, there's no sweat off your back as far as the cost of fixing it. You're going to call the landlord and you expect them to repair it, correct? That's a gross, that's a gross lease payment. Okay? Now, let's talk about the net lease, or sometimes called triple net. Very often called the triple net lease. Well, if gross means before expenses, what do you think net means?
After.
After expenses. A net lease is one where the tenant pays rent after they've paid all of the expenses associated with the property. So they pay the expenses first, and then they still also pay what? Rent.
Rent.
So in this lease, who is going to be responsible for repairs on the property?
Tenant.
The tenant. Who's going to be responsible for paying the property taxes on the property?
Tenant.
The tenant. Who's going to be responsible for paying insurance on the property?
Tenant.
The tenant. And after they pay all of that, guess what they still have to pay? Rent.
Rent.
Why wouldn't you just buy a property instead of renting from somebody else if you're going to do that?
Well, that's a good question. Probably can't afford to buy it. Maybe it's this is because these are always in commercial settings. It's probably a small piece of a big property.
What do you mean?
You're not renting the entire property. You're renting an office suite. You're renting a store inside of a huge shopping center.
Would that be like a strip mall? Yeah.
Strip malls use triple net leases. Warehouse spaces use triple net leases. My family, we used to own a sports bar in Roanoke Rapids. Don't ever do that. Good God. So glad when my dad closed that finally and retired. Because I ended up being the one to have to go up there and play bouncer all the time. It's not fun. It's not fun. I mean, there are times when it's useful to be 6'5" and 300 pounds, and it's useful in that setting, but it's not fun still. The building my parents still own, and it is leased now by Spectrum. Was Charter, now it's Spectrum. And they use it to house like their maintenance crews in the area. They do like dispatching from there. And they came in there and they rented the building for the next 20 years, and they have a triple net lease. They pay all the maintenance on the building. They pay for the insurance on the building. They pay the property taxes on the building, and they pay monthly rent to my parents. I'm like, my mom said, should we do that? I said, yes, because you won't have to worry about anything. If the taxes go up, who cares? Who pays it? The tenant. If the insurance goes up, who cares? Who pays? If the HVAC system blows up, I don't care. Let them be hotter. They'll fix it because it's their responsibility, right?
But do they have to use like someone that you approve of, even because it's their technical?
In our case, no. But it depends on how the lease is written. Could the lease be written to say that you have to use our service providers? Sure. Remember, everything's negotiable in these leases.
Travis, I have a question.
Sure.
So the tenants, it's their responsibility to make sure everything is maintained, right?
In a triple net lease, correct.
Okay, because my dad, he owns a strip mall, and it was kind of funny this got brought up because it literally happened like a few days ago. And one of the stairs, and I don't know, if something was broken, and this little kid fell. And they had brought someone, the tenant did, to fix it. They brought like a contractor or whatever, and they paid him, and he never fixed it. And then they were trying to sue my dad because, like, the mom was, because her child fell. And I was like, telling my dad, I'm pretty sure that's like the tenant's responsibility, not yours, because they brought someone.
Depends on how the leases are structured, but most likely it is the tenant's responsibility, generally speaking. Now, as far as the liability goes, that'll be for a court to decide. But generally speaking, as far as the maintenance goes and the upkeep, if it's a triple net lease, it's a tenant responsibility.
Yeah, he didn't get in any trouble because his lawyer was like, you're perfectly fine. Like, that's not on you. But it was just kind of like.
And this is one of the reasons why commercial landlords, let's be honest, every landlord would love this lease if every landlord could do it. If you're the landlord, isn't this the landlord's dream lease right here? Where you know exactly how much money you're going to get for rent. You never have to worry about maintenance, upkeep, taxes, insurance. It's all the tenant's responsibility. Every landlord would do this if they could. The ones who don't are mostly the ones who are forced not to, which are residential landlords. Residential landlords are forced by law to do gross leases. And does that answer your question, Terry. Yes, all residential leases in North Carolina are required to be gross leases because of the maintenance piece. Okay, are we all okay on a triple net lease here? And the difference between a gross lease and a triple net lease? Ethan says, what if the property taxes aren't paid? Well, obviously the owner would step in and pay them. They're not going to let them go unpaid because the property could be foreclosed upon, but that would immediately be a violation of the terms of the lease by the tenant to not pay their property taxes, and they could be evicted for that. And they could be sued for it, and they could have all kinds of liability for it. You know, obviously the landlord's not going to let the property taxes go unpaid, but if the tenant is responsible for them in their lease, that would be an immediate violation of their lease to not pay them. Okay, we good here on the net lease? I would imagine you'll see, you know, probably one question where they want you to differentiate between a gross lease and a net lease. So you would need to know the two of them. You might also see a test question about a payment structure called a percentage lease. These are becoming much less common as time goes on because the one place where they were popular was already dying in the United States. And that was prior to the pandemic. I would imagine we have seen the last great gasp of mall space in this country for the most part, except Crabtree Valley and South Point. Those two will survive anything. You know, I don't know why they're so popular, especially Crabtree. You could not pay me to go to Crabtree Valley Mall and fight that traffic. There's nothing, if they said today and today only, they were giving away everything at Crabtree Valley Mall, I would go the other direction. I hate that place that badly. But people love it. I wish I owned it. I would love it if I owned it. Yeah, Triangle Town Center, exactly, Anna. It was already dead or dying previous to this. There is no way it will survive this. And Cary Town Center is gone. Ethan said he works at Crabtree, and he agrees. You know, it's like.
Do you think the outdoor malls like Mayfair and Wilmington will be the future?
I think the mixed, like North Hills, and one of the reasons South Point has done so well, but so much of it is exterior facing. And even at Crabtree, if you notice, they've done a really good job of trying to make over the exterior of Crabtree. For those of you that are familiar with it, you know, it used to be an all interior, old fashioned mall, and now so much of it is faced toward the parking lot. Yeah. So it's just, you know, mall space is dying off. But mall space was traditionally leased with these percentage leases. So here's the way those leases work. You pay the mall a flat monthly fee, which is small. So like let's just talk about Belk at Crabtree. I happened to get a sneak one time at a lease for Belk at Crabtree. And Belk's lease at Crabtree, I mean, it was for, you know, some ungodly amount of space, like 96,000 square feet or something like that. I mean, we were talking just huge. Here's what their monthly rent was. And I'm not kidding you. For 96,000 square feet, their monthly rent was this. That's all. That's it. Oh, wait, I forgot the other part. Where's the money coming from? That flat $10,000 or that 5% of their sales?
5%.
5%. Old man Belk is crazy anyway.
Well, that is the way mall leases have been structured forever. And everybody in there, every tenant in there is probably on a different percentage. You know, so like somebody like Belk might be at 5%, but those little, the folks that are operating the little kiosks out there in the mall, you know, the little ones out on the islands, they're probably at 25 or 30% of their sales. And so the financial stability of the mall itself is tied directly to how much the stores are doing in sales. So when you see malls failing, even when they have tenants in them, it's because the tenants really aren't paying anything if nobody's shopping in those stores, because most of the rent comes from the actual sales being done. That's a percentage lease. Okay. So could you think that's enough for you to identify that on the test? Because that's really all they're going to ask you about. is to make sure you know what a percentage lease is and where it's most commonly used.
No, they can take a percentage of whatever they want, can't they?
What do you mean?
It doesn't specifically have to be for their sales, does it?
Well, no, but that's generally the way percentage leases are based. It's, you know, some flat monthly amount plus a percentage of the sales done during that time.
In this case,
no, go ahead, Sarah.
Go ahead. Okay. So the landlord or the mall owner would be responsible for marketing and maintenance.
Exactly. That's why
taxes and everything.
one of the reasons this sort of evolved was it was a way to keep everybody on the same page. You know, you wanted the mall owner to do things like decorate for the holidays and have big displays and have events at the mall. Well, the way to incentivize them to do that was if they knew if they bring in more customers, they ultimately make more money in rent. And so that's where the percentage lease came from as a business model. Plus, it allows retail stores, which historically have huge swings in revenue. I mean, imagine the revenue in a retail store in November and December versus January. I mean, some retail stores in January actually have negative revenue because of returns. They have so many returns that it actually outweighs what they sell. You know, and so what it does is it allows them to pay very little rent in those months when they have almost no sales, but then big rent on the months where they have big sales. And so the mall looks at it as sort of it averages out over the year. But that's the percentage lease model. Okay. The full service lease is a lease that is still popular in one area. Now, that's prior to the pandemic. It remains to be seen how popular this lease model remains after the pandemic, because one of the most impacted spaces is office space with the pandemic. But full service leases, and full service is exactly what it sounds like. Think of a full service lease as like the kind of lease you have when you go to a hotel. You don't pay separately for utilities. You don't pay separately for water. You don't pay separately for using furniture or linens. It's all, and you don't pay separately for the janitorial service. It's all inclusive. That the price you pay is all inclusive of those things. And that is true in full service office space leases as well. So it doesn't, the tenants don't pay individual utility bills. The tenants don't pay for their own janitorial services. It's all factored into their lease. And the reason this has been done in office space is because it maintains the quality of the office space, because usually office buildings are shared by many tenants. So if you think about it, like if you have an office building and on this floor, you've got 5 different tenants. Inevitably, you would have one who would never run the air conditioner if they had to pay their own power bill. And so it would be hot in that part of the building. Or inevitably on another floor, you would have somebody who never cleaned up. Like they didn't vacuum the hallway in front of their suite. They never took the garbage out, and it just looked like a dump. So office space, because that kind of devalues the whole facility, will basically say, we're going to take care of all of those things. We're going to provide you with utilities. We're going to provide you with janitorial services. We're going to stock the restroom, and we're just going to factor it all into your lease. Which means the cost of these leases is higher, significantly higher than almost any other types of leases, because you have factored in all of those things.
I have a question. So like you said, it's primarily for office spaces. What about like luxury apartments? Because a lot of times they'll include like trash and everything in your rent, like
you could see this, and full service leases are possible in residential because full service is even higher than a gross lease. A gross lease says the landlord has to pay for maintenance and upkeep. A full service lease goes even beyond that. So it is possible to have full service leases in residential. So some of those residential settings would be considered full service leases. That ones are including everything. All right, are we all good on the different payment models there? Let's talk about some wonky leases that people are not as familiar with. A ground lease. Well, the name tells you what they're leasing. What does the name say we're leasing here? The what?
The ground.
The ground. That doesn't mean there's not a structure on the property. It means that the tenant is only leasing the ground. It means that if there is a structure on the property, the structure probably was put there by the tenant, not by the landlord. So you think about what's going on here. Somebody is renting land to a tenant, and the tenant actually spends the money, invests the time, energy, and money into constructing their own improvements on somebody else's land. If you were going to spend that kind of money on somebody else's land, do you think you probably want a short-term lease, or would you want your lease to be for a pretty long period of time? If you were
Really long time.
Long time.
It's going to be a long time. So the way to recognize these leases almost instantly is there for long periods of time. Cell phone companies do this for cell towers. They will lease farmland to put the cell tower on, and they'll lease it. But then the tower is constructed by the cell phone company. McDonald's does this. Your local McDonald's near you, the land is owned by the McDonald's Corporation. And they lease the land to the franchise holder. The franchise holder then pays to construct the building and upkeep the building, but they lease the land from McDonald's. And that's how McDonald's makes their money. They make very little money off of actual hamburger sales. That's how the franchisees make their money. McDonald's Inc. makes their money off of the leases of the land. So if you wanted to open a McDonald's, for example, and you go to them and you say, hey, I want to put a McDonald's right here on this corner. It's a great spot for it. They would say, that sounds like a great idea. And then they would go buy the land. McDonald's would buy the land. And then they would turn around and lease it back to you. And that's the only way they'll give you the franchise.
In fact, you need, to get into a McDonald's franchise, you need to have $1 million liquid.
So how many of them do you have, Kay?
I have 5.
Yeah, 5 of them. Nice. Nice. Good for you. So what things do we need to see in a lease? The same things. Sheila wanted to know, is it only McDonald's or other fast food and gas stations? Some of them use that business model. McDonald's has by far been the most successful with it. The same contract provisions that we need in other contracts, we need in leases. So we need that mutual agreement. We need consideration. There has to be money involved, or the promise of the exchange of money. It's got to be for a legal act, and we got to have the same legal capacity of the parties. So it's just like any other contract as far as the requirements go. Just some random sort of vocabulary pieces that you need to be aware of when it comes to leasing. You need to know this word upfit. That might show up in a test, the word upfit. Upfit is an interesting piece of terminology, and it's an easily confused one. This is in commercial real estate. It's commercial. It says it occurs when a commercial landlord customizes, and this is the most important word right here, customizes the property for the tenant. It is not fixing up the property. It is not updating the property. It is not upgrading the property. It is customized, because all those things are good for everybody. If we have a shopping center and we redo the front outside of the building, we put stonework up and we repaved the parking lot, that is updating, but not upfitting. Upfitting would be a tenant comes to me and says, I want to put a nail salon in this space. But here's the problem. We need 8 sinks in here, and there's no plumbing. and the landlord says, I'll put the plumbing in for you. That's an upfit because it was done for that one specific tenant. It customizes that space for that one specific tenant. Now, just like this is almost like the reverse of a ground lease. In a ground lease, the tenant is leasing the ground, and then any improvements they want, they do it themselves. This is the opposite. This is the landlord saying, you tell us what you need and we'll make it work for you. But just like a ground lease, what kind of lease terms do you think we're going to be looking at here if the landlord does a bunch of upfit? Are they going to want to see a 1 year lease, or are they going to want to see 5 years, 7 years, 10 years if they have to upfit this thing and spend a bunch of money?
Long-term leases.
Very long-term leases, yeah. Longer-term leases, because they have to recoup that expense. This is a way of commercial landlords trying to lure in tenants, because the tenant doesn't have to spend a bunch of money out of their pocket to make the space work for them. Because it's expensive to get a commercial space ready for occupancy, to get it ready to conduct business for them. And you've probably, some of you may remember, you don't see the sign nearly as much as you used to, but how many of you remember seeing signs in front of shopping centers or that sort of thing that said, we'll build to suit? You know, in other words, we'll build it out the way you want it. That's an upfit. That's what it means. It means the tenant comes in and says, I want this, 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 and this. And the landlord bases the rent off of that. They figure the cost of making those improvements is figured into the lease amount, and they recoup their money over time. It lowers the upfront cost for the tenant, helps them get started. Everybody okay with that terminology for upfit?
I have a question. What's like, so you're pretty much just adding fixtures for the tenant, right?
It could be fixtures, it can be reworking plumbing, it can be reworking electrical, it can be new flooring, it can be new carpeting, it can be, like for example, I was talking to a commercial landlord yesterday, and he's negotiating a new lease with a doctor's office, and because of the pandemic, one of the upfits they want is they want separate zoned HVAC systems. They want the patient examination rooms on different HVAC systems than their office spaces are. And that's going to require a replacement of all the entire ducting and HVAC system in that space. And they came to an agreement on that. So it is customizing the space in any number of ways for that particular tenant. And it's just a way of attracting the tenant, you know, because it's part of the negotiation process for the tenant, you know, and obviously the tenants pay higher rent as a result of the upfit. If you take the space as it is, you can rent it for cheaper than if you get it customized. All right, we all good there? Very popular in commercial real estate, upfit. We talked about assignment of contracts already. Assignment of a lease works exactly the same way. What did we say an assignment was? It was changing what about a lease?
Parties.
Or changing the parties. So if we're substituting out one party, now most often it's not going to be the landlord we substitute out. What party would we probably be substituting if we do a lease assignment?
Tenants.
The tenant. For whatever reason, the tenant that signed the lease is no longer able to or willing to fulfill the requirements of that lease. So they have decided to move on, and they have generally helped locate another tenant, and that new tenant is going to go into the place of the old tenant on the lease. So the new tenant takes over exactly where the old tenant left off. The same amount of time is remaining on the lease, the same monthly rent, the same terms, the same conditions. It's just take one tenant off and put a new tenant on. That is an assignment of the lease. Sublease is a new tenant comes in, but they rent it from the old tenant. They pay their rent to the old tenant, and then the old tenant pays the rent up to the landlord. Usually you sublease when you're taking a loss on space. If you need to vacate a space and you can find a new tenant, but they're not willing to pay the full amount, you'll sublease it to them, and then you just make up the difference versus having to pay the full thing. That's where you usually see subleasing happen. As far as the rights of landlords, unless a landlord says in their lease, they do not have the right to enter the property. There is no such just guaranteed right of a landlord to enter the property. If the landlord wants to enter the property while the lease is going on, then they need to write that into their lease agreement with the tenant. So some common reasons that landlords might say, well, okay, we need access to the property. Some common reasons would be repairs, inspections, maintenance on the property, but all of that would need to be written into the lease to give the landlord legal access to the property. So make sure that you have, Brittany asked a question, if there's a new tenant, this is a sublease question or a assignment question, if there's a new tenant, they can change the purpose of the space. That depends on certain things. If it's strictly an assignment, probably not. Because if it's strictly an assignment, you're going to take exactly the terms of the old lease and apply it to the new lease. But a lot of times landlords are open to, sort of renegotiating those terms as part of an assignment. So, if there was a renegotiation, then yes. All right. As far as the laws of North Carolina about leases having to be in writing, leases do not have to be in writing in North Carolina to be enforceable unless, and you may see a question about this on the state-specific section, unless they are for more than how long?
3 years.
3 years. Now, we're not saying that the tenant's been in the property for more than 3 years. We're saying the written lease, the actual agreement, the term of the agreement is longer than 3 years. If the term of the agreement is longer than 3 years, it is not enforceable unless it is in what?
Writing.
Unless it is in writing. Okay? Additionally, and so there's another note down here about leases of longer than 3 years in North Carolina. Additionally, the tenant should record them. Not only should they be in writing, but the tenant should do what with them?
Record them.
Record them, because here's what the law says in North Carolina. Leases are appurtenant to the property. What does that word appurtenant mean?
Runs with the property.
Only attached.
So if a property is sold and there is a lease in place, does the lease stay in place?
Yes.
Yes, and the new owner has to honor that lease. That's a requirement in North Carolina. But here's what the law says. Unless the lease was for more than 3 years and was not recorded at the local county courthouse. In that case, the new owner does not have to honor the lease. So if you're a tenant, like a commercial tenant, and you've got a 7-year lease, and you want to make sure if the building gets sold, your lease gets honored, what should you do with that lease?
Record it.
Take it to the county courthouse and record it. Take it and get it recorded. Otherwise, as a tenant, you might not be protected. So leases of longer than 3 years must be in writing, and they should be recorded. That's probably a good spot to take a break. So why don't we do that? Let's take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk about the Residential Rental Agreements Act and some of the specifics of that. So it is 11:30. I'm struggling with the time. So it's 11:30. Why don't we say 11:40? All right. So be back at 11:40.
Just have one quick question.
Go for it, Sierra.
When you say recorded, that just means like signed?
No, recorded means you have taken it to the county courthouse and you have paid them to make it a matter of public record.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you.
Yep. So before we took our break, we left off and we were talking about the different structures of leases and the different payment types for leases and all those things. Now we want to focus and zero our focus in specifically in North Carolina. This is North Carolina, so this would be in the North Carolina specific section. This is not generic to the national section. This is specific. The North Carolina section of the exam and the North Carolina Residential Rental Agreements Act. So this is a law that applies anytime we're renting residential property in the state of North Carolina. The law requires something called a warranty of habitability. It requires that the landlord provide a property in residential leases that they are required to maintain for basic safety and health hazards. For test-taking purposes and in real-world purposes, this is probably the most important note on the screen right here. This is never negotiable in North Carolina. Repairs on residential property to maintain it in a fit and habitable condition are not negotiable in North Carolina. Now, other repairs beyond fit and habitable might be negotiable, but basic repairs to maintain the property in a fit and habitable condition are not negotiable. You are not allowed by law to say to the landlord, well, don't worry about fixing the heat. I'll pay you $200 less a month. You don't have to worry about fixing the heat. That conversation cannot happen in North Carolina in a residential rental. The tenant and landlord are prevented from engaging in that sort of a negotiation. So be careful to recognize that when you're in a residential lease, these certain repairs are just not negotiable. And examples of stuff that is required, I'm not going to go through the whole list because you won't be tested on the whole list, but just as an example of the minimum requirements, heat capable of maintaining 65 degrees, and working plumbing and electrical systems, and then smoke and carbon monoxide detectors. Those are all the minimum requirements of leases in some examples of minimum requirements in leases in North Carolina. So if there is a plumbing problem, there is no question about who will maintain it because North Carolina residential rental law says that it must be maintained by the landlord. Brittany has a great question over there. Is there a time frame they have to fix the issue? What the statute, the law says is within a reasonable time frame. Obviously, that's a gray area, but it does say a reasonable time frame. So it would always be up to a judge to decide if you had operated within a reasonable time frame. I would say that really depends on the kind of repair we're talking about. If it's something like heat in the middle of winter, a reasonable time frame is probably a day or two. And if you can't provide them with heat, then you should probably provide them with alternative lodging for that time period. But if it's something less pressing, like, a plumbing issue in a bathroom, but there's 3 bathrooms in the house, reasonable time might easily be a couple of weeks in the eyes of a judge. So it's going to definitely be weighed out by, a judge or a magistrate. Has the landlord acted in and so that's not going to be tested. It's not something you'd have to worry about from a test-taking perspective. As far as what happens if the landlord doesn't do what they're supposed to do, that's what a landlord breach is. We're talking about now what happens if the landlord breaches the lease and their promise to maintain the property. The tenant can sue the landlord. They can sue the landlord for damages. We can take them to court and we can sue them for damages. And part of those damages could include any rent we paid while the property was not up to the minimum level. So if for example, let's say Tasha was renting a property to Beverly and the heat was broken and it's January. And Beverly notifies Tasha, and it takes Tasha 3 weeks to finally fix the heat. Beverly could take Tasha to court and file a lawsuit to get a refund of the rent she paid for those 3 weeks. So this is supposed to be, back to your question, Brittany, it's supposed to be one of the things that prevents in some ways landlords from waiting too long for repairs, because in theory they could be sued for rent that was paid to them while the property was not being maintained. However, the tenant has one other option, and my guess is you might see it on the state-specific section of the exam, because this is a fairly unique thing to North Carolina residential rental law. If the landlord is not maintaining the property, if the landlord is not fulfilling their obligations under the lease, then the tenant has the right to evict themselves. Basically, the right to break the lease. That's called constructive eviction. You need to know that terminology, constructive eviction. That is when the tenant has evicted themselves. So they can move out and stop paying rent after they move out. But let me be very clear what a tenant cannot do. They cannot stop paying rent while they are still in the property. Even if the property is not being maintained. Even if and this is where people get really twisted up about landlord-tenant law in North Carolina. Even if Tasha just flatly refuses to fix Beverly's heat, Beverly still has to pay the rent as long as she stays in the property. So Beverly has 2 options if Tasha won't fix the heat. And she can do one or both of them. She can take Tasha to court while she still lives in the property. And she can sue Tasha. And she can say, Your Honor, I've been paying rent all this time and I still don't have heat, and I've told her about it. And she would probably win, and she would probably get her rent back, and Tasha would be forced to fix the heat. What's Beverly's other option if Tasha won't fix the heat?
She can move out, evict herself.
She can do constructive eviction. She can evict herself, remove herself from the property, and do constructive eviction. But here is the key with constructive eviction. She still has to pay rent as long as she is still in the property. There is no, so on a test, what they may throw out at you, because it sounds fair and it sounds like, well, that's a reasonable thing. What if they say the tenant calls the HVAC company and has the cost of the repair deducted from her rent? Can the tenant do that?
No.
The tenant can also not say, Tasha, I'm not paying you rent until you fix the heat. That's not within the tenant's rights in North Carolina. So make sure you don't answer those on the test. Nor can the tenant and the landlord come to some agreement. Oh, well, you just pay me $1,000 less this month and we'll forget about the heat. That's also a no-no, okay? So none of that can legally happen. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I'm sure a lot of this stuff happens every single day. But as far as the Residential Rental Agreements Act, it's not allowed, okay? The tenant's got to always pay rent as long as they are still in the property. Let's see what case.
Okay.
Go ahead, Sarah.
I think it is kind of related to Caitlin's question. So does the tenants have these rights only when one of the 3, the heat, smoking detector, and plumbing is not fixed, or is it about all of them?
That's not the full list of things. I just gave some examples. There's you'd have to actually look at the Residential Rental Agreements Act, and it's more detailed about what the minimum requirements are. But basically, your basic thought is correct. Yes, the only reason the tenant can constructively evict themselves is if the landlord is not maintaining the property in the minimum way.
Okay.
That's where constructive eviction comes in. Let's see what Caitlin says over here. Before I bought my house, I rented an apartment and I was pregnant. I found black mold in my spare bedroom closet, which was going to be my daughter's room. They refused to fix it and took them 6 months to get it fixed. And I moved out the day after they fixed it. Could I have sued them? Caitlin, based on the idea of landlord-tenant law and the Residential Rental Agreements Act, I'm no attorney, but I would say yes, you probably have some sort of a legitimate claim there if, and this is where things really get, and it's always up to a judge or a magistrate, if you made it clear that entire time that this was a problem, that it needed to be fixed, if you documented the problem, that's where the rubber really meets the road on these kinds of things, is what communication has happened between the landlord and the tenant. What you can't do is just pop up in court and say, well, I told them 6 months ago they needed to fix this. And then they said, well, but if it was such a problem, why didn't you continue to engage with them? You know, and that's the real gray area of a law like that.
Yeah, I told them multiple times. I went in there all the time, and I was like, look, the black mold's still there. It was growing too. It was like getting a lot worse. I had to move all of her clothes to my closet, and it was really bad. It was horrible.
Yeah, so for future references, that document that in writing, those kinds of interactions, because those could be really useful with a landlord. Take pictures. Yeah, exactly.
This
question
happened to me.
Go ahead. Go ahead. I'll get Cassie and I'll get Elizabeth.
So I had a townhouse before I lived in my current apartment, and it's one of the reasons I actually don't rent from individual owners anymore, because it was messy. I moved in my townhouse, and it was middle of winter, and in the lease it said that the gas and heat were provided by the leasing office. So I'm at work one day, and my son is at home with the sitter, and my heat turns off, just shut off. So I called the management company through I leased it from, and they actually had to come out there within that same day because I had no heat in the middle of winter. And I pulled out the agreement and was like, y'all are supposed to actually provide heat. It's not something that I have to do. And they actually had to pay my heat, which wasn't technically supposed to happen for my entire lease period, because they did not include it in my lease.
Because the lease said it was included, yeah.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
No, my only question was, is it fair to say that it's never okay for a tenant to withhold or not pay their rent unless they move out first and constructively evict?
That is correct. That is absolutely perfect way to state it, is that the tenant can withhold rent after they're out, not while they are in possession of the property. And I've had people say, well, how do we know, if a tenant's going to constructively evict themselves, how do we know if, they might not be sued by the landlord? Well, they could be. I mean, because the landlord could sue them and say you violated your lease, but then it would be up to a judge. And that's why I say the documentation becomes so important in that, to document and say, I have asked the landlord numerous times to address this issue. It's clearly a safety issue. They haven't done it, that sort of thing. So you'd want to be able to show a judge or a magistrate. And that has been known to backfire on landlords. We've had landlords who sued tenants who constructively tenant constructively evicted themselves. In one case I was familiar with in Wake County. The only reason I was familiar with it is because I was at the courthouse for something else, and the magistrate was hearing this case before ours. The landlord was suing the tenant for breaking the lease. And the tenant came in, and the tenant said, Your Honor, I did move out. I moved out, and the reason I moved out is because we hadn't had hot water for a month. And the tenant produced like 15 emails that they had sent to the landlord, basically begging the landlord to come fix the water heater, because not only was it not, producing hot water, it was actively leaking in the residence, and the landlord had not sent a plumber over there in a month to address the issue. And so they walked in there with the landlord suing the tenant for breaking the lease. They walked out with the tenant having a check from the landlord for the rent they paid during the month that they didn't have hot water. So not only did the magistrate dismiss the case against the tenant, but the magistrate entered a judgment in favor of the tenant, who didn't even realize she was just there defending herself. And the magistrate said, well, did you pay rent for that month? And she said, well, yes, sir, I did. And he said, well, that's not right. We're gonna fix that right now. So it's been known, it's been known to blow up in the face of a landlord or two.
That's exactly who told me that I can go to my leasing office. My best friend, her dad is actually a magistrate, and he found out that I didn't have any heat, and he called me and told me what I could do.
There you go. They know, the magistrates know the landlord-tenant law because that's what they deal with all the time.
But the leasing people I leased from didn't know that I knew a magistrate, so it kind of.
I'm sure. All right, so everybody good on rules. I'm sorry.
So there's technically rules with it that will say that they don't have to pay the rent if there's an issue, like for example, the hot water. Because like we've had a tenant who, the owner of the property did not want to fix the HVAC unit, and it was in the middle of the winter, and then there was no heat. And so we provided them with space heaters, but we only had like 2 space heaters, and it didn't cover, obviously it's not going to cover a whole house, and a space heater can't be left on all periods during the day.
Sure.
So they ended up going to a hotel and staying in a hotel for up to 2 weeks because the owners still just refused to get the heat fixed because they said they didn't have the money for it. They weren't doing it. So like our company actually paid for it out of their own pocket to have it fixed.
Yeah, that's the downside of property management. But the tenant has to still pay rent even when there's no functioning heat, but they might be awarded it back by a magistrate later on in court. They can be entitled to get it back, but they can't just elect to stop paying it.
Okay, so they weren't.
Unless they actually vacate the property permanently, like if they just move out, that's called constructive eviction. Okay. The process of a landlord evicting is called summary ejectment. So that's the legal process where a landlord goes in, and we call it eviction most of the time, but the actual legal terminology is called summary ejectment. It's a court action heard by a magistrate. It is the only legal way to eject a tenant who will not leave of their own free will. So if you have a tenant who doesn't want to leave, then you're going to have to go through the summary ejectment process. But there's no self-help eviction, no locking them out, no changing the locks, no, disconnecting utilities, no taking their stuff and holding it hostage. None of that. That's not legal. Not legal. So I had somebody tell me one time, but it works. I'm like, yeah, that doesn't matter. It's still not legal. Don't do that. Don't do that. Matter of fact, a couple in Johnston County actually were charged with grand theft because they removed tenants' property from the home they owned. And the tenant, they wanted the tenant out. The tenant wouldn't leave. So the owner went in there when the tenant was at work and took all their stuff out and hid it away in some storage unit to attempt to coerce the tenant to leave the property. Not only was that a bad idea from the sense of not getting the tenant out, but the owners were charged with grand theft. So don't do stuff like that.
Could they be charged with trespassing also?
They were charged with breaking and entering and theft. I think eventually the breaking and entering was dismissed, but the grand theft was not. So, I don't know what the original, the final result. I'm sure they played it down to something, but yeah, it was a bad idea, real bad idea. Okay, North Carolina has a law called the Protecting Tenants at Foreclosure Act. So this is the North Carolina Protecting Tenants at Foreclosure Act. So this is meant to protect, is what the law says, protect tenants who occupy property that is going through foreclosure. This law came about as a result of the mortgage industry meltdown that happened in 2007, 2008, 2009. It became pretty common, unfortunately, for tenants to be current paying rent in properties, but landlords not make the house payment, and for the property to be foreclosed. And at that point in time, The only notice the tenant would have gotten about the foreclosure would have been a sticker from the sheriff saying you have 10 days to vacate the property, because that's the way foreclosure law worked at that point in time. So this was obviously terrible for tenants who were doing the right thing. They're paying the rent. They have no idea that the mortgage payment's not being made. And so the state legislature passed a law and signed into law by the governor called the North Carolina Protecting Tenants at Foreclosure Act, which basically says if the tenant can produce a verifiable lease, usually written lease, that shows they were paying a normal market rent, then anybody who buys that property at foreclosure auction has to honor the lease. So the tenant does not get kicked out as a result of the foreclosure. So even if Bank of America buys the thing at the foreclosure auction, then all of a sudden Bank of America just became the landlord. So it requires that tenants still get to stay in the property for the duration of their lease, if the property is foreclosed on, with up to a maximum of 90 days if the person who's buying the property wishes to live in it as their home. If the person who buys it, so if it's not a bank that buys it at the foreclosure auction, but like if Anna buys it because she wants to live in the property, then she can give 90 days notice. But other than that, the lease has to be honored. Now, that doesn't mean the banks will necessarily honor the leases. What they'll usually do is go approach the tenant and try to pay them to leave, because they just want to get rid of them. So they'll go to them and say, hey, well, we'll give you your security deposit and the next month rent-free if you'll leave. They work out some kind of a deal. But they are required, if the tenant wants to stay there, to give them the full lease term. So it's a good law.
So Travis, this is different from commercial, because if the tenant in a commercial has a lease that is longer than 3 years and has had it recorded for like 7, the new owner has to honor that for 7 years. Is that correct?
That is correct. That is correct. And so this was more geared toward residential, but in theory, a commercial tenant would also be protected by this law. The Tenant Security Deposit Act. I would say this is a law you're definitely going to see on the North Carolina section of the exam, at least 1 or maybe 2 questions about how tenant security deposits should be handled in North Carolina. The first bullet point there is probably the most important one. It says tenant security deposits in North Carolina must always be held in a trust account. That is not negotiable. That is an always thing. Tenant security deposits must always be, and that means even private residential property owners who just renting out a house they own, if they're going to hold a tenant security deposit, they must open a trust account to put it into. That is not negotiable. What it means from a practical standpoint is that if you take a tenant security deposit and you don't put it in a trust account, the courts are going to make you give it back. If it comes to the attention of the court that Tasha is holding that security deposit in her own personal checking account, even if she's got it, even if she's kept it, even if she's guarded it, but she doesn't have it in a trust account, they're going to make her give it back. She's going to have no legal right to it. Even if the lease calls for it, even if the tenant damaged the property, none of that's going to matter if she didn't hold it correctly in the first place. So if you're going to hold a tenant security deposit, it must be in a trust account. And I've had people say, well, I don't know how to manage a trust account. You better learn. If you're going to hold a tenant security deposit, you better learn, because that's what the rule says. And it's an across the board rule. It's not just for people with a real estate license, it's for everybody. How many people across North Carolina you think are breaking that law right now? How many residential landlords do you think there are that have tenant security deposits not in a trust account? It's got to be tens of thousands, wouldn't you say? And here's what's crazy about that. If they end up in court with the tenant and they're fighting over the security deposit, the tenant can literally say to the magistrate, Your Honor, I did it. I trashed the place. I tore it up from the floor up. I just trashed it. But ask them where they held my security deposit. And if the magistrate looks at the landlord and says, did you hold the security deposit in a trust account? And the landlord goes, what's a trust account? Guess who's walking out of there with their security deposit back that day? And that's why the tenant's going to get it back every single time. And that's why it's so important to know that this law says the only legal way to hold one is to hold it in a trust account. All right. So that's where I would expect you would see a test question about that. Don't worry about the limits here. I don't think you'll see no test questions on these. These are just kind of, for reference purposes. The state does charge, does say you can only charge a maximum of a certain amount for tenant security deposits. Brittany asked, do you have to put in the lease itself where the security deposit will be held? And you do. That's a great point, Brittany. The state recommends that in the written lease, you have to tell the tenant where their security deposit is being held. You will definitely see test questions on this, though. This is prime target for test questions about the Tenant Security Deposit Act. What can we use it for? What can we use the tenant security deposit for? It can be used for the things that are over on the right-hand side of the slide over there. It can be used to repay unpaid rent. It can be used to repay for damage to the property above ordinary wear and tear. It cannot be used for ordinary wear and tear. We're going to talk about the difference in just a second. But it can be used for damages that exceed ordinary wear and tear. It can be used for somebody who breaks the lease or moves out early. The cost of cleaning up the property if they leave you with parting gifts when they move out. They leave their stuff, their junk there. And it can, if they breach the lease, if the tenant breaches the lease, you can actually charge like the marketing costs of re-renting the property. Because if they breach and you got to rent it back out and it costs you money to market it, you could charge that against the security deposit. All those things can be charged against the tenant security deposit. However, I want to point out to you, and I'm going to add this to this slide right here. Never before tenant move out. Never, never, never. Even if the thing that you want to charge for is on this list of allowed things, you can never take money out of the tenant security deposit if they're still in the property. So you have to wait for them to vacate the property. Remember, we said they only vacate the property one of two ways. They either do it of their own free will, or they are summarily ejected or evicted by the courts. In either case, you must keep that tenant security deposit in the trust account until the tenant has vacated the property. Is everybody with me on that? Don't touch that money. So, even if the tenant's 6 months behind on rent, should their tenant security deposit still be sitting in the trust account if the tenant has not been evicted yet?
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Don't touch it early. Okay. Now, once the tenant has moved out, then the landlord has the right to start to deduct from the tenant security deposit. And here is what the process they must follow in order to legally do that. Within 30 days, no more than 30 days from the date the tenant moves out, they must get a written accounting, of what was done with their money. And that means if their money's being refunded, they must get a refund within 30 days. If their money's being spent, you have to show them how the money was being spent. So let me show you what I mean here. And this is how people also get themselves in trouble with tenant security deposits. If you had a tenant who never paid you the last month's rent and moved out, and they never paid you because they just assumed you would just take their security deposit, can you keep their security deposit for failing to pay the last month's rent? Let's ask that question first. Once they moved out, can you keep their security deposit because they never paid the last month's rent?
Yes. Yes.
What if you never sent them a letter saying you had kept their security deposit? Guess what they would be entitled to?
A security
Security
deposit.
They would be entitled to get it back. They would be entitled to a refund of that security deposit, even though clearly they owe the money because you didn't follow the rules about security deposits. And the rules say within 30 days after the tenant leaves, you have to give them a breakdown of what you did with their money. I think that's, between that and the uses of the tenant security deposit and the fact that it must be held in a trust account, I think those are where the questions will come from about the Tenant Security Deposit Act. The one other thing I think we need to talk about that is this difference between ordinary wear and tear and damage. Because if we back up here, it said we could charge for damage, but only if it's more than ordinary wear and tear. What if it's more? Teresa asked a great question. What if they leave with no forwarding address? Teresa, you mail it to the last address you have on file for them, even if that is your own property. And so you would send that out, mail it to the last address you have on file. If they didn't set up forwarding, that's their own fault.
Okay.
But you would document that you would send it out to their last known address.
Thank you.
And that would be enough to qualify for the law. Okay. So what is wear and tear? So remember, these are things that we can't deduct from security deposit, from the TSD, tenant security deposit. And these are things that we can deduct from the tenant security deposit. Okay. Wear and tear, dirty or worn carpet, peeling, cracked, faded paint, general dirt, so like just ordinary run-of-the-mill cleaning cannot be deducted from a tenant security deposit. Frayed curtains and blind strings cannot be deducted from a tenant security deposit, but actual damage can. They painted with unauthorized paint colors. They didn't get your permission and they repainted the property. That could be charged. They got burn holes in the carpet. They destroyed it. That could be charged. Make sure you document these things. Make sure you document these things. Okay. So on the test, I don't think they're going to give you a gray area one. They're not going to leave you with one like, I don't know if that's wear and tear. If they're going to say like clearly, like wear and tear, or they're going to say like for just like, normal cleaning between units, between tenants. Normal cleaning between tenants. Can you charge a tenant security deposit for that?
No.
No, absolutely not. Okay. So now, and I've had people ask, well, my lease says I have to clean the carpets. Does that mean I don't have to do it? That's not what I said. What I said was they cannot take that out of your tenant security deposit. They can still bill you for something that your lease says you're responsible for. It's just limited what they can take out of your security deposit. So, like, for example, if somebody has a lease that says you have to have the carpet steam cleaned when you move out, and the tenant doesn't do that, the landlord could send them a bill for the steam cleaning, but they'd also have to send a refund of the security deposit. They could not deduct the steam cleaning from the security deposit because that's not an allowable use of the security deposit as far as the state is concerned.
Travis, wouldn't stains on a carpet be the same as a dirty carpet?
They are not. Stains are defined as ones that cannot be removed. So dirty means it can be clean. Stains means it.
So basically, you can't deduct if the carpet can be cleaned, but you can if it's something that you cannot bring back.
Generally speaking, yes. But I will tell you that once you get into the actual area of this kind of practice, a lot of magistrates won't even let you deduct if the carpet is completely destroyed, depending on the age of the carpet. If you go into court and you say, okay, well, we're deducting $1,000 from your security deposit for damage to the carpet, the magistrate's going to say, well, how old is the carpet? And you say, well, it's 12 years old. And they say, well, then it had no value because carpet's only valuable for 7 years. So you should have been replacing it anyway. Get out of my face and give them their money. So it's not, you have to be really on your game when it comes to deducting from a security deposit. You have to really know. But they're not going to get down in the weeds like that in the test for you all. Last thing that shows up here in chapter 11 deals with the North Carolina Vacation Rental Act. Basically, all the stuff we just talked about, the Residential Rental Agreements Act, the Tenant Security Deposit Act, is that a lot of hoops that landlords have to jump through and understand and stuff they have to know? You know, you have to give the tenant all these rights. It's a lot, right? If we didn't have a law that said vacation properties were different, then vacation rental owners would have to live up to the same terms and conditions of regular residential rentals. Meaning, so let me give you a hypothetical situation. Let's say you own this house right here, and it rents for, let's say during the high season, it rents for $12,000 per week, which is entirely possible out on the coast in the high season. Let's say that thing rents for $12,000 a week. When we were talking about residential rentals, what did I say was the only two ways the tenant could legally leave the property? Either of their own free will or what else?
Summary eviction.
The summary ejectment process, the eviction process. That eviction process takes a minimum of 45 days. How much rent would you lose at $12,000 a week if you had to wait 45 days to get this person out of this property? It would be astronomical, the losses. Are y'all following me on why that's a problem? So we have a law that says if your property is a vacation rental, you don't have to follow the other laws, basically, is what it says. So here's what you need to know. How does my property become a vacation rental? And the way it becomes a vacation rental is you show the state that the tenants are always renting for a maximum of 90 days, so 90 days or less for every tenant. There's never one longer than that. And the tenant must have permanent residence somewhere else. So it's really important on those leases to ask the tenant, where is your permanent residence? They need to provide you with an address for their permanent residence. If you can show those two things in court, number one, they provided me with address for their permanent residence. Number two, they are renting it for leisure purposes, not for work purposes or somewhere to live, but for leisure purposes. So the lease should say that. And they're renting it for less than how much time?
90 days.
90 days. If you can show the judge all of those things, you don't have to follow the Residential Rental Agreements Act. Guess how fast you can evict these people?
Right away.
Same day. Same day. It takes about 4 hours versus 45 days. It's a substantial difference. This is basically a way of having these properties function more like a hotel would, and having the ability to evict people in an expedited fashion.
Travis, I had to step away for a minute. Did you see Teresa and Brittany's comment?
I did get Teresa's. Brittany's I did not see yet. Example, carpet cleaning. Could they not ask the tenant if they want their bill deducted from their deposit to have the carpet cleaned? Yeah. So that was from the previous slide. Brittany, they could. They couldn't. The landlord could not automatically deduct those funds from the security deposit, but they could certainly reach out to the tenant and say, hey, we're going to bill you for this carpet cleaning, but we also have your security deposit, which we're refunding. Do you want us just to take it out of that? And if the tenant says yes, then that's entirely okay. But the tenant would have to give their permission.
But so technically, like if there was issues wrong with the property, they would have, the property owner or management company would need to go ahead and give them like an itemized statement of repairs that needs to be made, and then go ahead and give them their deposit back and say, this is what you owe us.
Well, not if those things on the list are things that are allowed to be deducted. If those things are that are on if the things that are wrong with the property are damaged, for example, you don't need to say to the tenant, we're going to bill you for it. You can just go ahead and take it out of the security deposit. But if it's things above and beyond what's on that list, then yes, you would need to send them their security deposit and say, but you still owe us this money.
Right. And then if it is beyond what their security deposit is, that's whenever you would send them
a bill.
The bill. Okay.
Okay. That's right. Okay. Teresa said, can you deduct any late fees for rent from a security deposit? Teresa, you could once they had vacated the property, but not while they were still in the property, because you can't deduct anything from a security deposit while someone is still occupying the property. So like if you had a tenant who had accumulated late fees for late rent and they had never paid them once they vacated, you could deduct those. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Have you ever heard of, like, say in a commercial lease, that instead of someone paying their security deposit ahead, that they tack it on to the last rent payment?
Yes, you mean you're referring to people that say we're not paying a security deposit, but we're paying first and last month's rent?
Yes.
And what I will tell you is that North Carolina courts have consistently said you can call it what you want to, but it's a security deposit. If what a North Carolina court will say is, when a tenant moves in, you can charge them for the first month's rent, because we charge rent a month in advance. But anything beyond that is to be treated as a security deposit.
Okay.
Yeah.
Before we move on, do you mind going back to the protecting tenants during foreclosure slide?
What about it?
I'm just not understanding at all.
What do you not understand? So what's a foreclosure? Talk to me. Help me. Help me help you.
It's like when you're not paying your mortgage.
Who is you? Don't use pronouns. Use landlord or tenant, because you'll talk.
Tenant is not paying their mortgage.
Oh, the tenant would pay a mortgage? You need to look at that again. The tenant doesn't pay a mortgage. Who would pay the mortgage?
The owner.
The owner of the property. Who owns the property?
Okay, now I understand. This is in a lease situation. I'm thinking.
Ah, there you go. See, that's why I force you to do that, because when you walk yourself through it and you start thinking, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. These are all in leases. So this is protecting tenants in a foreclosure situation. So this is when the owner, the landlord, is not making the mortgage payment, and the owner and landlord gets foreclosed on. What happens to the tenant who's occupying the property?
Right. Okay. Perfect.
You need me to put the slide up again, or are you good?
No, that's perfect. You answered my question perfect.
Okay. Good. Good. That is it for Chapter 11, Landlord and Tenant. And that's probably a pretty good break spot for lunch, because it's 12:30. So why don't we say 1:15, and we'll come back and talk about some property management and fair housing stuff. All right. So see you at 1:15.
Brittany asked one question, but we can get it